What do we need to do to get America back on the right track with respect to Guantanamo Bay, Ukraine, and other places around the world? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question.
Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle. Great to be back with y'all. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, Happy New Year and good to see you again.
Happy New Year to you, to our viewers and listeners, and the start of a new year, which let us hope has glimmers of liberty rather than more statism.
Yeah, let's hope so. First of all, let me thank y'all for your end of year support. We're very, very grateful. Those of you that send us donations, we're just very appreciative and very honored. If you forgot to make your donation, there's still time to do so, at least for this year, and we'd greatly appreciate your considering to do that. So, Richard, in the news is the standard stuff, really, but prominently in the news is foreign policy. This is the 20-year anniversary of the prison and torture center and the military tribunal judicial system of the Pentagon and the CIA at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. There's also rumblings of war in Ukraine. So I thought, well, this is a nice opportunity to start out the new year to talk about what the U.S. national security establishment is doing to our country, what it's doing to people in the world, and what we need to do to get this country back on the right track. I mean, as you know, we've got two big infringements on liberty in this country and privacy, and that is the welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. I mean, that's a gigantic part of our lives. It's become a permanent part of our lives. Well, hopefully not too permanent. But then we've got the warfare state, or the national security state, or the deep state. And that has proven to be a tremendous threat to our liberties as well. The founding fathers understood this. This is why they opposed standing armies, which was their term for what President Eisenhower called a military-industrial complex. And that was why there was just a basic military force for more than 100 years. Certainly not large enough to go and embroil itself in wars in Asia or Europe or to slay monsters. I guess the foreign policy of America was best encapsulated by John Quincy Adams' 4th of July address in 1821, entitled In Search of Monsters to Destroy, where Adams says, look, America's not going to send troops abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And by monsters, he's referring to tyrannical regimes, wars, conflicts, revolutions, famine, all sort of horrible things that are killing people or impoverishing people. By the same token, they had a policy of open immigration, which essentially sent the message to the people of the world that, look, if you're suffering from any of these conditions and you're able to escape, there's at least one country that you can come to that will never forcibly deport you, so return you to your country of origin. So, of course, everything changed with the conversion to a national security state after World War II. And we see that we got the old Cold War racket for some 45 years or so. And then after the Cold War racket ended in 1989, we end up with this whole war on terrorism arising from the U.S. government's interventionist policies in the Middle East. And along with this war on terrorism came this base at Guantanamo Bay. Now, they've always held this imperialist base, and that's what it is. It's an imperialist base. It stretches back to the early 1900s, the Spanish-American War in 1898, when the U.S. stepped into the shoes of the Spanish Empire and took control over Cuba, as well as other colonial possessions of the Spanish. But it was after the 9/11 attacks that the Pentagon and the CIA decided to convert this into an independent operated torture center, prison center. They said that it was going to be a Constitution-free zone. They didn't have to worry about the Constitution because it was in Cuba. That's why they located it there instead of the United States. They didn't want any interference from the federal judiciary, federal courts, the Supreme Court. Well, the Supreme Court put the quietus to that notion in the case of Russell versus U.S., where they held, well, no, we do have jurisdiction over this. But as a practical matter, even though they released a few people on habeas corpus, the fact is that the Pentagon and the CIA have control over what happens in Gitmo. And by and large, Congress, the president, the Supreme Court, the federal judiciary, they defer to them. And the way we know that is that there are people there that have been there 20 years without a trial. I mean, that's incredible. In the Bill of Rights, people are guaranteed the right of speedy trial. They're guaranteed a trial by jury, and they don't even get any kind of trial. You know, they set up this kangaroo military system early on when the Supreme Court said, "Well, no, you're gonna have to have trials for these suspected terrorists," because the Supreme Court never bought into this notion that terrorism is an act of war. They said, "No, this is a criminal offense. Now that you've set up this new judicial system, which is not anywhere authorized in the Constitution, you got to put these people on trial." The Pentagon and the CIA have just ignored them. And we know they've ignored it by the fact that there's people there 20 years without a trial and brutally tortured. There's been presidents that have tried to shut it down, or at least one, President Obama, he came in committed to shut this travesty down, and he had 8 years to do so, but he couldn't, and people wonder why, and they wonder why President Biden lets it go on. Well, there's a simple answer to that, one that people don't want to confront, and that's because Biden doesn't have the authority, and neither did Obama. The real authority with Guantanamo lies with the Pentagon and the CIA. They're the ones in charge. Nobody's going to jack with them. The Supreme Court's not going to jack with them. Congress is not going to jack with them. Well, Congress is essentially owned lock, stock, and barrel by the national security establishment. And the president can't do anything. We've learned that with Obama and now Biden. So, you know, what's the ultimate solution to this? I mean, well, the moral solution is close it down and leave. Don't even keep Guantanamo, the base there. I mean, close down this horrific torture and prison center they have, but also just leave the island. Guantanamo belongs to Cuba. It doesn't belong to the United States. But how will that come about? Well, I think the only solution is the American people. That Americans have to finally just break out to a higher level and say, you know what? We can't let the military and the CIA control things anymore. They are making an absolute mess of life for Americans as well as for people overseas. What do you think, Richard?
Well, I think that the difficulty is that there is this mindset since the end of the Second World War, growing out of the Second World War, that America's role, its duty, its destiny is to be, quote, the arsenal of democracy, to be the bulwark against tyranny around the world, that the responsibility of the United States is to have bastions of bases everywhere, because at any point there can be a threat to the free world and especially America. And this goes across party lines. It doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican, whether by the traditional labels in America, whether you're liberal or conservative. The fact is that there's this presumption that America has this duty and responsibility to be the gendarme of the globe. And one indication of this is that the United States must have tacitly the authority and the ability, the de facto power to do whatever is needed to secure the safety of the country and those parts of the world viewed as of importance to us, which of course in the limit means the entire world. I've never heard any American diplomat or cabinet official or president say, well, yes, the United States has national interests around the world, but they do not include area or region or country X. By tacit implication, there is not one corner, crevice, or place on the entire globe that is not in principle of importance to the U.S. national interest, if so defined by those with the active power and authority to implement diplomatic and military power someplace as they think is warranted. So basically, if one defines the outreach of a government to extend its authority and its power, both political, economic, and militarily, to other parts of the world, there is a strongly imperial character to what America has been in foreign affairs since the end of the Second World War. And one indication of that is that you must have places to hold those who you view as enemies of the state, in this case defined as terrorists. But as you correctly point out, they have these places outside of the borders of the 50 states that give them extra legal justification to hold people without trial, without actual charges being made, instances of forms of enhanced interrogation. That's a euphemism for forms of torture. And when you want to use enhanced interrogation methods that exceed even their de facto notions of acceptability, you just send the person in your custody to some other country that's our ally in a part of the world where they don't even have that degree of nicety. And that person could really be, in the traditional linguistic sense, tortured and killed. Notice another thing here, if I could just continue with this for a minute, Jacob. So now you're doing, let's say, the waterboarding, right? You create a situation in which a person feels as if they're drowning to cause this fear of death to get them to talk. What if the fellow keeps saying, I don't know anything? I don't know anything. Well, including up to death. Well, there's one of two conclusions. He knew nothing, or the interrogator said, what a tough nut he was. He'd rather die than tell us. But that's the whole point. That's the whole point. You have no way in that method of knowing whether he's telling the truth or not. Anything that happens to him, he confesses and lies, or he doesn't confess and he dies, are demonstrations that, well, we were right to hold him and do this to him. So there's no checks and balances. There's no conception of inappropriate and unusual punishments, torture, and that basically means that when these places exist and these methods are used, it's basically saying that the government or that branch of it has a carte blanche to be an absolute totalitarian imposer of its will on others. And if I can just extend this to one other instance of this relating to America's presence around the world, and this has to do with this newfangled technology called the drone. Through drones, the United States has the ability to fight conflicts in other parts of the world in which it's worth killing for, but not dying for. You send an unmanned drone to some place in the Middle East, for instance, with or without the knowledge of the government over whose territory that is their jurisdiction, and you proceed to bomb and strafe those who you declare to be terrorists or threats to the United States. And if you hit innocent bystanders, as has happened to that entire family during the withdrawal from Kabul in Afghanistan, you say, well, it's an imperfect world. Mistakes get made. Next. Now, this is the mindset, that this disregard. We've moved a long way from an earlier age when Herbert Hoover was still president, when a Secretary of State, when informed that the FBI was interdicting the mail of some foreign diplomats, the department member said, a gentleman does not read another gentleman's mail. We've moved a long way from that mindset. Now the government can read anything. In fact, trying to read your mind, if they view you, for some reason, you're in the wide umbrella, the net of a threat or a suspect to what they view as national interest concerns. This is a dangerous institutional setting.
Yeah, it really is. And it's really plunged America into a dark age that didn't exist in the 1800s. I mean, in the 1800s, America was a limited government republic. And there was, by and large, there was transparency in government. and there was a basic, relatively small military force, enough to protect settlers out west from attacks by Native Americans or Indians, but certainly not large enough to threaten the American people. And that's what the Founding Fathers and the framers understood, that the biggest threat to people's freedom and well-being does not lie with overseas threats. It lies with your very own government, and especially a government that is well armed with a big, strong military intelligence force. And that's where everything changed. And after World War II, the big bugaboo, the communists are coming to get us, the Reds are coming, and everything changed at that point. The government acquired the power of assassination, coups, regime change operations, alliances with brutal dictatorial regimes, the installation of brutal dictatorial regimes like General Pinochet's regime in Chile. It just goes on. And then, of course, the organized programs of assassination, including now with drones. But before that, there was Operation Condor, which I think a lot of Americans don't know about, and this organized right-wing regime, South American assassination, kidnapping, torture ring that the CIA was part of. In other words, they've sent America into a dark age with respect to morality and correct principles, and they're making things a lot less safe for us. And so let's transition now into what's going on in Ukraine. There's a debate over what happened when the Cold War ended. The Russians said, well, we were led to believe that NATO would not expand, that it would stay right where it was. And then the defenders of NATO say, oh, well, no, it wasn't in the final treaty. Well, regardless, Richard, everyone knows what's going to happen when NATO starts absorbing Warsaw Pact countries and starts keep moving closer and closer to Russia's borders with military bases, U.S. military missiles, troops, and of course, Russia kept warning, you're getting closer and closer, but Ukraine was going to be the ultimate. If Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, now the U.S., before the invasion of Crimea, the Russian invasion, the U.S. would have evicted Russia from Crimea. They would have put a U.S. military base there, missiles on Russia's borders. There's no way the United States would ever countenance such a thing if Russia were doing it over here. And the Russians are, they're paranoid. And with some justification. They don't want U.S. missiles on their borders, and then so you've got this giant crisis when really what should have happened at the end of the Cold War, if not before, which I would have preferred, NATO should have just been abolished. The whole purpose of NATO was ostensibly to protect Western Europe from a Soviet attack. Well, once the Soviet Union dismantles, what do you need NATO for? But from this mindset of the U.S. national security establishment, they were not ready to let go of the Cold War. We often forget that. It wasn't their choice to end the Cold War. It was the Soviet choice to end the Cold War. As far as the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA were concerned, they wanted this thing to go on forever and ever and ever. It was their way to milk it for everything it's worth, all the budgets and the defense contractors and the ever-increasing money and power and influence that comes with this Cold War against communism, godless communism. They wanted to keep that going, and they've succeeded in doing it. Look, the big crises now with Russia, the old Cold War enemy, China, the old Cold War enemy. I'm surprised they haven't riled up things against North Vietnam or against Vietnam. They still have their embargo against Cuba. They've got this base in Cuba. But with the embargo, they're trying to starve, kill Cuban citizens in the hopes that they'll finally revolt and oust their communist regime and install another pro-U.S. dictatorship like that of Fulgencio Batista, the pro-U.S. dictator that Castro ousted. So that's the other thing that Americans need to do a lot of soul searching here, Richard, as to what is the role of government in a free society. Do we want a national security state way of life? Look what it's done to this country. Look what it's done to people of the world. It's really it's perverted our moral values, our values as a free people. Imagine Americans defending torture. When I was a kid, I thought that was like the medieval era, where you'd see those horrible machines that, European tyrants would use to torture people. And now here the U.S. is doing it as a matter of policy, and there's people defending it, saying, "Oh, this is the right way to go." What we really need, I think, is a great awakening in this country, where people say, "You know what? This is not what this country is all about, and we're going to put a stop to it."
I think what we also need to realize is that there are certain situations that will be outside the control of the United States if they push these types of foreign interventionist policies. For example, this 20 years of war went on in Afghanistan before this, quote, official withdrawal that we watched from the Kabul airport. There's still residues of it in Iraq, America tacitly in Syria. But the US government and the military establishment learned an important lesson from the Vietnam War. Do not have a draft. Do not conscript people, and do not put huge numbers in harm's way that will result in wild and angry demonstrations, protests, and acts of civil disobedience against what the US is doing abroad. A 20-year war that saw tens of thousands of American military personnel rotated in and out of Afghanistan and Iraq. But by using a volunteer army and by devising ways to minimize both the casualties and the visual appearance of those casualties before the American media, the result was that they could fight this. If Americans at home do not feel the pain, the loved one who has been sent there against his or her will, the loved one who has been injured or killed, the visual appearance of watching hundreds, if not thousands, die per month, as was happening in Vietnam. Remember, over 50,000 American military personnel died during that conflict. Now, we've seen less than 3,000 killed in Afghanistan in 20 years. That's a tragedy for each and every person and their family. But 2,500, 3,000 people over 20 years, that's a statistical blip, which is able to be hidden from the visual and emotional reactions of the American people. So instead, you have television shows like Army Wives, who some of the viewers and listeners may know ran for several seasons, in which it's the families at home giving support to their loved ones who are doing their tours of duty in Afghanistan or Iraq. And it's okay because they're performing their service to protect America. There's no movies like Platoon. There's none of these other anti-war movies that were coming out both during and certainly immediately after the Vietnam War, because they basically sanitize it from the visual appearance and the personal impact of the vast majority of the American population. And if you can technologically and logistically do that, the U.S. government can continue to get away with a lot.
Well, yeah, and if you want to do a war movie, the Pentagon's policy is they will not lend any support at all, like letting you use weapons and so forth, background tanks and so forth, if you're even remotely presenting an anti-war message. That they are the ultimate decider of really what's going on in Hollywood with respect to war movies. And your point about Afghanistan is very interesting also, because there was some concern, of course, for the number of troops that were being killed, even though it was minimal. But from what I could gather, Richard, there was absolutely no concern among Americans about the Afghan people who were getting killed. And the same in Iraq. It was like it just didn't matter. You know, I always heard ministers saying, well, let's say a prayer for the troops, but they never prayed for who the troops were killing. And yet in Iraq, it was a clear-cut war of aggression. I mean, there was no question that Iraq had never attacked the United States. And so here U.S. troops are killing people, including Iraqi troops. They're the aggressors. Iraq was always the defending nation in this, and yet we were always supposed to support the troops and never pray for the people the troops were torturing and killing. And in Afghanistan, it was the same sort of thing. There was never any evidence providing Taliban complicity with the 9/11 attacks. The real beef was that George Bush demanded that they extradite Osama bin Laden. And the Taliban regime said, well, we don't have an extradition treaty with you. But they were also willing to consider it. They said, well, show us some evidence and we'll send him to a third-party nation where he'll be treated fairly. And the Bush administration wouldn't have anything to do with that. And that's why they invaded. It had nothing to do with Taliban complicity or knowingly harboring bin Laden. It was because they wouldn't turn him over. So the other aspect of this is what's going on today. As many of the commentators are saying, the Biden administration, or primarily the Pentagon and the CIA, they have this horrible system of sanctions, brutal system of sanctions on the now Taliban regime. And it's like, they're never going to forgive them for defeating them. But the people who are bearing the cost of this are the Afghan people. I mean, there's a huge humanitarian crisis. And I'm not here suggesting that the U.S. should be giving them any aid, like some of the people on the left are saying. I'm saying lift the sanctions, leave them alone, let them try to bring their society back, regardless of who's in charge over there. But boy, these people are brutal. They will not let go of these sanctions. They're bound and determined to continue killing as many people in Afghanistan as they can, in the hopes that the Taliban regime will collapse and they can say, oh, well, see, we told you so, you should have kept our regime. Same thing in Iran. I mean, you've got this brutal system of sanctions against Iran, and where is the outrage among Americans? I mean, they're targeting innocent people. We condemn terrorists for doing that. They're targeting the Iranian people with death and suffering. There's people dying because of those sanctions, and they're impoverishing them. Where's the moral outrage? And that's why I keep saying is that there's got to be a great awakening in this country, and forget this blind allegiance to the Pentagon, the CIA, and this blind trust that they know what's best, and start developing an independent awareness of what's happening and the consciousness of saying, this is not what we want America to be doing. And one of the principal things I would advocate immediately is lift all sanctions against every country. They are the height of immorality and brutality.
Well, I think that the wider canvas is that there needs to be a reevaluation, which unfortunately is not likely to happen today or tomorrow, but a reevaluation of what is the legitimate role and purpose of government in a free society. If that were to become the debate, a serious debate and discussion, one perspective that would be made, which is basically the classical liberal libertarian one, is that government exists to protect and secure the rights of the citizens of its own country, the life, liberty, and honestly acquired property of its citizenry from both domestic and foreign aggressors. But that this means the government does not intervene. The government does not intervene into social and economic affairs of its own citizens when those actions are peaceful and non-fraudulent and mutually beneficial. And the United States government does not have the authority. It should not have the authority legally, and certainly not morally, to proceed to be fighting those monsters in other lands merely because those in power in Washington, D.C. have decided to classify and designate them in that way. Until there's a broad re-questioning and debate over the nature and role of government in a free society, both at home and abroad, unfortunately, these tragedies and circumstances will continue. And as I was suggesting, there can be a situation in which it gets outside of the control of the U.S. government. It can't just maintain and confine it to within Afghanistan or Iraq. You to undertake this type of aggressive approach over Ukraine or over Taiwan in East Asia, and the other side may decide that it too cannot give way, and what seems to be a small regional or local conflict can become a cataclysm involving major powers with both huge conventional and even nuclear weaponry.
That is a great point. I mean, you mentioned that they don't have a draft, but boy, all of a sudden they get into a major war, and there will be a draft not only of men but of women as well. And this is what a lot of young people don't appreciate. And the fact is that as part of NATO, this is what often Americans forget, they are committing to come to the defense of every member nation in NATO if they're under attack. So if Russia decides it's going to invade Ukraine for some reason or other, we're looking at war right there against a nuclear power. And sure, both powers would try to refrain from using nuclear weapons, but as soon as one commander on the ground used tactical nukes, you know things would get out of control immediately. But what business does the U.S. government have essentially mortgaging the lives of the American people, pledging them as collateral to defend these Eastern Bloc, former Warsaw Pact countries? I mean, it's just, it boggles the mind, Richard. I mean, I certainly don't want to give up my life for that, and yet I don't have any control over this. They have this power by admitting these countries into NATO to essentially pledge our lives as collateral to their grandiose imperialist schemes. And I think your point about what is the role of government in a free society, and that's what people ought to be dwelling on, that's right on. Because it's not enough, as people on the left are saying, to close Guantanamo or to close the torture center at Guantanamo and free those citizens, those people that are there. It's just not enough. What we have to do is raise people's vision to a higher level. What is the role of government? Do we want a national security state type of governmental system, or do we want the restoration of a limited government republic, which was our founding governmental system? These are the types of things that will bring freedom. But in order to bring freedom, people have to think about them. And that's what we at the Future of Freedom Foundation is all about, is raising people's vision to a higher level so they'll be thinking at that higher level and put us on the road to liberty, peace, prosperity, and harmony.
Absolutely.
On that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all again for your support. We greatly appreciate it, and look forward to seeing y'all next week. And Richard, Happy New Year, and a Happy New Year to y'all, and Happy New Year to you, Richard, and I'll see you next week.
Until next time.